Välkomna till Arkitekturdagarna i Malmö. Mitt namn är Gunilla Kronvall och jag är verksamhetsledare för det som heter Sveriges arkitekter på Formdesign Center. Hållbarhet och klimatförändringar är en stor fråga för arkitekter, inte minst för de som arbetar med städer och landskap. Vi ska nu få höra från en praktiker med erfarenhet av att arbeta med klimatåtgärder i olika delar av världen. Welcome to the Swedish Architecture Days and to a talk titled Design with Risk with Matthijs Bouw. It's great to have you with us, Matthijs.
Hi Gunilla, how are you doing?
Good. How are you? What time is it over at your place?
It's 9 a.m. in the morning.
Okay, well, good morning.
I live in New York.
It's good to have
and
you.
we're still locked inside.
Yeah, it's different times, huh?
It is at different times. Yeah.
Okay, well, I hand over to you, Matthijs.
Okay, thank you. Hi, so my name is Matthijs Bouw, and what I would like to talk to you about is how I think our profession is changing in relation to the risks that are coming with climate adaptation. And I'm trained as an architect. I work as an architect and as an urban planner, both in with offices in Amsterdam and in New York. And one of the things that I've come to understand is that we are going into an extremely turbulent period. If you look at, and this is a chart from science. If you look at the big picture of changing climates and changing sea levels, you see that we come from a very stable period, and now with the Anthropocene, the era in which we are changing the workings of our Earth systems, we are going into a period of great change. And that great change will at some moment start leveling off, but it will start leveling off in a really different condition than we are now. And as someone who is from the Netherlands and as someone who lives in New York, which are both sort of coastal places, as is Malmö, these are things that we need to consider. What I want to do today is lead you through 3 continents and to see how in different continents we are working differently on adapting with the climates and dealing with risks. The first place that I want to talk about is New York, where we have a practice and where we've been involved with working in this city since Superstorm Sandy. The second place I'd like to talk about, or at the end I would like to talk about a bit more about the Netherlands, which is this very constructed landscape that has been developed over the last centuries. How do you work in that landscape? And in between, I'll take you to Asia, to the north coast of Java, where I'll talk a bit about our work there using nature-based solutions at a scale for a sinking and flooding coast. This is a graph that I would like to keep you in mind, which is sort of central to my thesis, and it's in some way an extrapolation or a zoom in on the earlier graph that I showed you. We are coming into a period where we know our climate is changing rapidly, but we don't really know how quickly that change will happen. And so, for instance, we don't know where we'll be at the end of the century. But this is a graph that shows the possible ranges for New York City between maybe 1 foot of sea level rise if we get our act together. I think we've passed that station, to maybe 6 or 7 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And not knowing, and I mean, we're all architects, our clients want certainty of knowing where we'll end up, is a huge challenge. Specifically also when we realize that whatever we design now will be there at the end of this century, or much of what we design now will be there at the end of the century. Another thing that is really interesting is that once you start to think about the pace of change accelerating, it also means that we need to start making our decisions about what to plan and what to make earlier. So how do we deal with that dynamics in an era where basically, and I think you've all seen this picture, it's of a sculpture in Berlin, nicknamed Politicians Discussing Climate Change, in a period where it's become really difficult from a sort of political perspective to deal with uncertainty, to deal with risk, but also to really proactively start changing and mitigating for this changing climate. New York. The project that I want that brought us to New York was a project that I worked on with my firm on architecture, together with BIG, which is a Danish architecture company. You might have heard about them, and it was a design competition called Rebuild by Design, and in that design competition we made a design called the Big U. As you know, New York City has been impacted dramatically by Superstorm Sandy. A lot of physical impacts like flooded infrastructure, floating cars, but with that also comes a lot of social impacts, because if the power is out in a city like New York, the old lady who lives on the 20th floor cannot come down and get food. And if they're isolated, because I mean, it's a big city and people are living very much apart from each other, that becomes a real problem. So there's a strong connection between the physical infrastructures and the social infrastructures. About 60 people died, and the impact of the city, of this disaster on the city was dramatic, and it really caused the city to start thinking about, well, how vulnerable are we? And so specialists and professionals, of course, had been thinking about it, but for the first time it became into the public view that a city like New York is largely built in the floodplain. It is at a high risk of flooding for which it is unprepared. It doesn't have, like New York, like the Netherlands, dikes and all kinds of protective systems. It is pretty much open to the water. And part of that fragility is also caused by the fact that the water has often, for a very long time, been a source of economic growth. We have placed our port areas there. We have reclaimed land. You can sort of start blaming the Dutch for that in the case of New York. In the 20th century, we put our infrastructures there. We put our highways there. So we have increased the vulnerability of our lands over time, leading in Lower Manhattan to a rather deep flood zone, as you can see in this image. At some points, the flood zone is about 6 blocks deep, and actually, you could imagine during a big flood, a river connecting the two sides of Manhattan, basically charting Canal Street. The city had proposed after Sandy, in a special report, a whole host of measures to start adapting to this climate change and storm risk. And one of them was an integrated flood protection system around Manhattan. And Björk and I thought about, like, how do you do that? How do you do in a city that is slowly starting to sort of reconnect to the waterfront, that has started to appreciate its waterfront? How do you protect this 10 miles of coastline? And it's not for nothing that Merkel looks so grumpy here. Temporary solutions at this scale don't really work, and at the same time a wall also would not really work. So what we did is we took our cue from the High Line, where we have a piece of infrastructure that is not used anymore, that has been made into what you could call a social infrastructure, an amenity that has really revitalized a neighborhood. And we thought, well, maybe we don't have to wait until infrastructure is not used anymore. Maybe we can start to think about program in relation to that infrastructure very early, because program allows you to think about people, and maybe we can connect the resiliency infrastructure that New York needs much stronger to people and to program. And that led to this idea called the Big U, which was really in which we sort of reconceptualized this large piece of these 10 miles of infrastructure as a necklace of smaller infrastructures that would be connected and that would protect this geography. And by thinking it smaller, it allows us to really tailor make each piece of infrastructure to the geographic location and to the community that it would be localized in. And it will also allow us to build this thing in phases. And our idea was really to say we need the big thinking of Robert Moses, but we need to combine it with the community-oriented thinking of Jane Jacobs, and maybe, as Bjarke says, we should make the love baby of these two. And once you start to come up with an idea like that, it became really clear that, especially in the United States, where there is no culture of doing public projects, and where we really feel we wanted to connect to the communities, stakeholder engagement is a critical part. It's not really the focus that we need to put on design per se, but really what we need to do as designers is engage all the different people who are in this space and who are thinking or who are affected by such projects. So we talked a lot to all kinds of public entities, but also a lot to the private sector and to the different community groups. And in this competition, rather than really making a design at first, the focus was really outreach. It was connecting to people to understand what they want, but also understand how they go about making cities and how this would be different, because we need to start thinking about different paradigms of what a city could be in terms of a changing climate. Our main collaborator in this was a group called LES Ready, which stands for Lower East Side Ready, which was an umbrella group of a lot of community-based organization. Mostly on the Lower East Side, which has been heavily impacted by the storm, which has a very, very deep floodplain, as you can see here, which is mostly comprised of sort of large housing complexes called, let's say, towers in the park, very much a product of the Moses area, which has a huge ethnic diversity. If the blue parts are predominantly white, the green parts, where we were working, are Latino, and the purple parts are the Chinese, which is much poorer than the rest of the city by almost a factor 10. If the average household income is about 200,000 plus in the purple areas, it is about maybe $20,000 in the reddish areas, and which is, as I showed earlier, this sort of large repository of affordable and public housing in the city, which is all under great stress, not only because there's a constant disinvestment from the federal government in these type of houses, but also because of now repeated impact through climate events. This is what this area looks like. On the shore, we have a park, we have a highway, and we have the towers in the park. So it's a typical 20th century coastal landscape that we needed to reconsider in order to build a coastal protection system. And we did that with the community by setting up a planning group. And rather than bringing a design in, we brought in a series of models which would have typologies of how you could start to contemplate protecting the coast. Some of those ways in which you could approach it were more like urban furniture, which could have like a function, a double function, as a social infrastructure. Some of them would be much more integrated into the highway systems or into buildings, but others would be very comprehensive solutions with basically covering the highway, creating a levee, putting a park on top. And what we did is we brought those models into the different communities and then basically had conversations with the communities about how we could start to utilize these solutions in their area. So rather than us as designers coming with sort of a vision and a design idea and starting to sell that, what we really did is we tried to work with the communities of coming up with the right designs. And there you see that communities are really fantastic because they have so much knowledge about a place. They have such great ideas about what is needed, that it was really allowed us to make a design that is extremely tailor-made, that maybe at this place that I just showed with East River Park would elevate the surface road in order to create a coastal protection system, but then use that elevation to cross the highway, which would allow this park to be finally used by the neighborhood, because the park is very badly connected to the neighborhood, sort of envisioning what that could be in the future, in the longer term future, but also using in what we call, let's say, a bridging berm, which would connect the neighborhood to the river, but also using at other places, for instance, where the highway is elevated, different tools or different solutions that would fit locally. These are not so nice spaces, particularly at night, so we thought maybe we could conceive of a sort of public artwork wall during storms as a flood protection system. Maybe a bit further down, we can start to build pavilions or markets under, so temporary uses under the FDR that could double as flood protections, with the openings at the right spaces in order to make sure that the vistas to the water were still connected. And maybe even more down, we could integrate the flood protection into new amenities that the neighborhoods needed, including what we call a sort of reverse aquarium, which was really focused on having people understand these changing conditions for the city. Because if the Big U is anything, it is not only a practical solution which protects against floods, it's not only a social infrastructure that can be used for the 365 days or 364 days that it doesn't flood, but it's also a project to have a different conversation about the impacts of climate change in the city. And this is then the sort of well-known picture of that project. We won the competition. This meant that the city was awarded a large sum of money to start implementing that, and that has led to the first project that came out of the Big U, the Eastside Coastal Resiliency project, which is basically spans this geography of the Lower East Side alongside East River Park, which is going to be sort of reimagined with much better connections and a much more space for what you could call passive recreation, a much more optimized park that at some moments could flood, and that was really thought of as a place for the community. So what happens in New York, which is a place that is really sort of unprepared for climate change, that has a very vulnerable coast, climate change really became a way to reimagine that coast, to fix some of the inequities that are in that city, to really focus on investments into these poor communities, and really is used as a sort of vehicle to start to bring a conversation about climate and risk into the public. In Indonesia, the challenges are quite different. In Indonesia, I'd like to bring you to northern Java, for which this is an old map, where you see that the northern coast is very shallow. It is at the end of a large watershed coming down from the mountains that are sort of along the middle of Java, and that low-lying coast is slowly sinking. It's sinking because of subsidence, and it is drowning because of rising seas. In Java, you see how there the sort of traditional infrastructures, the sort of flood walls that have been built in the past, are not strong enough to deal with these forces of nature, and are starting to crumble and sink right in front of you. So there, we discovered that there are really different types of solutions that you need in order to deal with these complex dynamics of water and soil. There, the solutions needed to be much less traditional engineering, which is still a large part of the big U. We are working in the United States in highly constructed environments, but here we need to bring back an understanding of nature and use nature-based solutions, or as we call it, building with nature for large hydrological projects. And the way we have been working there in a consortium called EcoShape, which is a consortium that consists of engineering companies, dredging companies, knowledge institutes, not-for-profits, and us as designers. We have been looking at can we save this mangrove coast and strengthen this mangrove coast using the forces of nature by building fences, bamboo fences along the coast that then help to trap sediments, which can then form the basis for new mangrove growth. So here you see an aerial village of the sinking area view of the sinking coast. You have one of the villages in the back, and you see the bamboo fences sort of constructed, and what they do is they trap sediment. So here you see how we are, or EcoShape, together with the local community, is building a sort of new system for coastal protection, but which also has other benefits by making these permeable structures that on the one hand reduce waves, but also that allow sediment to settle behind it, which is then a basis for mangroves to start to regenerate much stronger. And what you see as these mangroves start to mature, they form a sort of strong sort of coastal belt that is both protective, but that also has ecosystem services, as you would call it. What mangroves do better than rainforest is sequester carbon. They do that really well because they allow a lot of the carbon to sort of settle and be stored in the soil. They perform more ecosystem services in the sense that they attenuate wave action, and of course they're a great resource for improving biodiversity and strengthening ecosystems, which is then very important for the local population, because the fish that is spawned there can be subsequently fished and brought to markets as can the crab. So what you really see here is that as much as the New York project is a sort of project of social design, this is also very much a project of social design, where working with the communities through these problems and engaging them not only on the risks but also on the benefits is really critical for its success. And now that project is sort of scaling or maybe at least replicating itself a bit to the west, where we have a city of Semarang, which is the third biggest city of Java, which is also a rapidly sinking city, which will create huge problems in the future, where all the economic activity which is now on the coast will no longer be viable, and where any project starting to address this will have this sort of combination of hard infrastructure solutions, which could be sort of elevating certain areas and creating levees, and mixing them with these nature-based solutions that help us restore the ecology, bring back biodiversity, and increase the resilience in these areas. And so one of the things that really to us feels hugely exciting about this type of work is that we are starting to, on the one hand, undo the sort of monofunctional and functional thinking of the 20th century, where our engineering was mostly also comprised of, let's say, hard systems, and reintroducing nature in much more hybrid systems that allow us to balance the natural ecosystems with the social ecosystems and the industrial ecosystems. And I think that's really the challenge that we have for the 21st century. We are becoming very aware of that because of climate, a changing climate, of course, but not only a changing climate, all the other risks that have come with traditional industrialization, and we now need to sort of employ a much more integrated thinking and more systemic thinking about how to address these type of issues in rural areas as much as in urban areas. A third area that I would like to bring you to is the Amsterdam metropolitan area, because we still have a firm there. I have sort of now been had the benefit of a lot of the sort of knowledge that comes with that you build having a very international practice. And for us, it was really interesting to be sort of asked back into the Amsterdam metropolitan area to think about their climate adaptation planning there. And the Amsterdam metropolitan area is an area of about 3.5 million inhabitants, centered around the city of Amsterdam. And I'm not sure if you see this, you probably don't, but which you can sort of see at the center of this area. And also there it became really clear that we are moving into a completely different climate condition. We have to start calculating with significant more amounts of rains, which we started to visualize by Olympic pools. This is an image from a particular site, and much higher temperatures towards the end of the century. In some way, the climate in Amsterdam will start to look like the climate in Umbria now, which might feel nice in winter, but is not so nice in summer. This area, like many areas, it needs to accommodate significant growth in the future. And while we are looking at the entire system, I will not go deeper into that. I do want to sort of focus on the one area that is circled in red, which is an area where they plan to build another 30 or 40,000 dwellings from 2035 or something like that. And in order to sort of understand this, what we could possibly do there, it was very important to sort of map the development of this Dutch landscape, which over time has become this very much constructed landscape. It's where we sort of, as technology allowed us, we would drain lakes, put dikes around them, use our windmills to keep the water out, and use that as our sort of basis for urbanization over time. And the area that we'll be looking at later is then a polder that has been pumped dry only in the 1960s. This area is, much of it, as you know about the Netherlands, is below sea level, so it's protected by a number of dike rings, which we use to protect ourselves. And in the Netherlands, we are really thinking, like, how long is such a system sustainable? Now we have a number of canals and a large number of locks and pumps and dikes and polders in order to sort of maintain that system. But as you know, I showed you this image of sea level rise in the future, where we can have maybe as much as 15 to 25 meters. Of course, that is centuries away, but in the Netherlands, we're starting to think, what does that mean for this fragile technological construct that we have made there? So in the Netherlands, we're starting to think about different scenarios about our future. And there, the aspect of time, of course, is very interesting, but we think, for instance, that the scenario on the left top, which is it could be sustainable for the longer time, which is a scenario in which basically all the water that comes from the European hinterland is sort of pumped out into the much higher seas that we will have in the future. And this is a system that will work maybe for at least another 100 years. It's a system that is slightly different than another system that deals with higher seas, which is basically saying, well, we need to let the rivers flow naturally into the sea, but that would require huge dikes deep into Germany. Our current system requires a lot of buffer capacity in order to make sure that before the water is pumped out, we can buffer it somewhere if we have great storms or a lot of inflow from the rivers. But then we're also thinking that maybe in order to have extra buffer capacity, we need to, in the system to the left, extend our coast and create a series of artificial lakes that we can then use to buffer this water that is coming from the east. And last but not least, a sort of scenario which is identified as sort of moving with the water, which basically says we need to, apart maybe from our big cities, leave the coastal areas in the Netherlands and just move into the eastern part of the Netherlands or move to Germany. And this is really interesting, because once you start to think about these long-term futures, it means that that this technical system as we have built now is very fragile or brittle in the sense that we are working on an increasingly sophisticated system that cannot deal with these levels of change that are coming our way. So one of the things that we say, well, if you want to start building a much more resilient or future-proof system of water management and land use, we need to increase the buffering capacity, but we also need to increase the tolerance because the variations in rainfall are going to be much bigger. We need to make sure that we can uh, go towards different scenarios. So we need to improve the optionality. We need to learn more about how we adapt to these changing systems. In order to do that, we also need to reduce our complexity, and we need to make sure that not everything is connected to everything, because once everything is connected to everything, one thing going wrong can make the entire system collapse. So for this project, we said, well, let's prove in a number of concrete projects to see how this thinking can start and how in some way we can do area development which is much more future-proof, which in the Netherlands means, of course, starting with ensuring basic safety, but really disconnect local developments from the system, increases tolerance, and start thinking already about the longer term. Not think about 10 years or 20 years, but really start to put our time perspective in like 100 years. And when we do that well, we could start to think about these nature-based solutions, and those are attractive. We love those. Let's bring those and have people enjoy them much earlier, because that would increase also the economic feasibility of those types of solutions. So at this particular area where I talked about, we said, well, we really need to reconceptualize the way we approached our green infrastructure in the 20th century, very much driven by, let's say, the garden city ideals and with a limited set of functions, to a green-blue infrastructure that has much more ecosystem services, that doubles much more as a social infrastructure, that allows us to mitigate improve our health, have ecological benefits, but also really starting to weave that into the life of people. So not think of this as a technical monofunctional system, which is about managing water and maybe giving access to people for recreation, but really think much more in a much more complex way, thinking about what are the types of things that we address in buildings and what are the types that we address in sort of public space. Rethink our use of species in this, because we are in a changing climate. The stresses are becoming bigger. We really need these green-blue infrastructures in order to deal with those stresses. That means that they become much more important. Maybe even think about the sort of wind directions of how we decide open spaces, and then reimagine these type of developments to be much more future-proof. So this is a recent development in this recent Dutch polder in the city of Almere, next to the location where we have to build these 30 or 40,000 houses. And with that comes an understanding that maybe the way we designed our green spaces in the 20th century needs to be radically different in terms of its dimension, in terms of its scale, in terms of its rhythm, in terms of its direction, and in terms of its performance. And that's a huge task, but it's going to be really interesting to do it. And in this particular place where we have climate stresses, it is an area that is below the sort of Dutch inner lake, and this is some maps, some transects where we start to show how these climate stresses are related to each other, both their physical components as well as their social components, the ecological realm as well as the sort of physical realm. We start to show how these things are related to each other, and then we start to derive maybe solutions where we can say, well, if this lake is ecologically dead, we can change the depths and ecology in that lake to making it ecologically more diverse, but also use the dredge material to increase the levels in this particular area where we need to build, so that the subsidence risk and the flood risk is reduced. So these are the type of projects that EcoShape do in those lakes, which is again building with nature, using the dredge material and the sand to construct new nature by using building dikes and pumping the sort of settlements in those dikes and using that as a basis for nature development. This is what this sort of large-scale infrastructure looks like, but this is what it can become, and you already see that this is the bird watching house, so you can create all kinds of recreational amenities there. And we can then start to rethink how we use those settlements on land to start to make new environments, maybe even dunes. So our idea for this area, which you see here visualized, is to say, well, let's not wait until we need to build there. Let's start building nature now, because once we start to build this nature now, we will have everything in place that we need in order to build good neighborhoods. So basically, we needed to undo the 20th century technical systems and reintroduce, albeit in artificial means, much more ecologically nature-based, well thought out solutions in order to create the layers that would allow us to deal with these future risks that we are having there. So creating wetlands while setting apart areas for future development. What is great, if once you start doing that now, nature will have grown strong enough so that the benefits can be used immediately after when the people move to that area. You can start to think about temporary uses. You can start to create new lake environments in order to buffer all that water. We can find ways to be smart with this sediment to sort of expand these building with nature, these artificial islands, and even build some areas where we are raising the coastline in order to make sure that the connection between the city and the water is stronger, but also that is the area where you would put your critical infrastructure in what you could call a super levee, where you would have the evacuation in this lower lying area. So this would be a sort of vision for a future of the Netherlands that really starts to in a way reconceptualize our technical systems to be much more inclusive, to be much more thought in terms of growing over time in order to deal with these ever increasing risks. Because I think that's really, and I'll conclude there, the changing that we need to have in designing with risk, in designing for uncertainty, is that we need to use the capacity of our natural systems and bring that back into our urban environments in order to deal with change and in order to deal with the uncertainty that we have. Because if we continue on a path of technological optimization through a harder infrastructure, we create environments that are brittle and that cannot deal with uncertainty and risk. Thank you very much. I don't hear you.
You don't, right.
I hear you now. Yeah.
Right, there we are. Thank you for a great presentation and very clear examples of, I think it's especially interesting how you combine then the climate resilience issues with the social issues and designs, and really working with the communities and for the communities. I was thinking when you talk about thinking in terms of 100 years, how does that work in your experience in relation to your clients? I mean, developers and cities, municipalities, governments. How does that work? Do you have to spend a lot of time convincing, or are we there already that it's easy to talk 100 years?
No, it's very difficult. And that's really one of the challenges. And there's a couple of things that we try and do to make that conversation easier. We've discovered that even in a country as fragile as the Netherlands, it is very difficult to have norms that are looking out for longer than, let's say, 30 years, whereas we know that the real impacts of a changing climate will only come after. And so what we did there is we, in the Amsterdam project, we calculate the costs of future adaptation during the lifespan beyond 2050. And we said those costs will be high, and specifically if you don't create the space for it, they'll be even higher because you have to build underground tanks or blue roofs or all kinds of really expensive stuff. And then we said, we put those costs against the cost of using nature and thinking about a longer term. And then we say, well, one, these natural solutions are much cheaper, but also they are more adaptable. So that means that when you need to change things because of a different climate at a later moment, it's much easier to do interventions in them. And at the same time, they already provide benefits that could be in some way monetized, because people living on a dune is just a fantastic living environment that people will be willing to pay for. And so if a combination of those arguments, we think is starting to prove productive.
Right.
What is difficult in it, though, is that it changes the way in which we need to think about what government does and what the public does and what the private sector does, because we start using the public space to solve a lot of private sector problems. And so while they might understand that argument, bringing it into action is relatively difficult. But I think we're getting there.
Okay. I have one more question. If you could give a brief answer. It's because I'm thinking climate change, it still feels quite unreal, I think, for a lot of people, because the changes are, well, in one way fast, in another way, in everyday life terms, it's quite slow. So it's difficult to grasp it. I was thinking the kind of projects you're involved with, and this, not least in the sort of high profile cases like Manhattan, you get international recognition for projects like that, you get a lot of visibility. Do you think that can projects like that play a role in the discussion about the reality of climate change, both in terms of the local discussion and globally?
Yeah, quite often I thought, hey, in New York, we're in a unique condition. We're in the media capital of the world. It's been hit by a big storm. So it really started to change the conversation about climate in some way globally. At the same time, it's not always felt like that, but as we see climate impacts growing, the fires in California, the increased storm activity, we do see that people are getting aware, and then it helps to be doing these projects in New York, to have an example. It also helped in the beginning to have Bjarke on board, because he's an incredible salesperson for these type of things, so he could really tell that story in a fantastic way. So it helps, but I have to say that, for instance, in a country in the Netherlands, it's been a real challenge to get, let's say, the citizenry involved in those conversations. So in many places, it is still a place like people, professionals think about it. Our professional community is starting to think about it, which I'm very happy. But telling the story is still difficult, and that's why it's so important to start realizing projects and just show how our cities can be different.
Right. So when they start to become realized, it's in the physical world, and then it's easier to understand why they are there, and the discussion
Yeah.
we had in a different way. With that, Matthijs, I say thank you so much for the talk today, and I hope to catch up with you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great time and have a great rest of the architecture days. And thank you very much for having me. It's been a joy.
Thank you. Thank you.